Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. And also, the Search for the Ancient Bauble Kickstarter has launched, so make sure you go check that out. The Kickstarter campaign will last for 30 days, and after that, the playmat will no longer be available for purchase. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in for the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So, spoiler season marches on, and I'm definitely considering getting another cup of coffee. Early this morning, I was working on my first episode, which was about the Sword of Hearth and Home, where I talked about if it was the best sword of the sword cycle. And then on my most recent episode, I talked about Garth One-Eye, a commander that actually makes a Black Lotus, and no, I'm not joking. That's right, things are getting really strange in the world of Commander. Now you can legally have a Black Lotus in play thanks to this commander. But speaking of things getting strange in Commander, well, there's this. Grist the Hunger Tide. And yes, my title for this was, wait, this thing is a legal commander, because that is my first thought after I saw the news. Now, why isn't this your typical type of commander, and why was I surprised by this? Well, let's jump into it to find out. So, let's talk about Grist the Hunger Tide. Grist is a legendary planeswalker named Grist. It starts off with 3 loyalty, and it costs 1 black-green. It says as long as Grist the Hunger Tide isn't on the battlefield, it's a 1/1 insect creature in addition to its other types. Its +1 says create a 1/1 black and green insect creature token, then mill a card. If an insect card was milled this way, put a loyalty counter on Grist and repeat the process. Its -2 is you may sacrifice a creature when you do destroy target creature or planeswalker. And its -5 says each opponent loses life equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. And then it also says Grist the Hunger Tide can be your commander. Wait, no. It doesn't say that at the bottom there. You know, like what you would normally see on planeswalkers that can be commanders. So much like previous planeswalker commanders like Freyalise, Llanowar's Fury, it would need to have that text. Simply by saying at the bottom, can be your commander, makes it so that it, well, can be your commander, even if it's not a legendary creature. Now, as for my actual thoughts on planeswalkers as commanders, well, I'll hold those for another time. The only other types of planeswalkers as commanders that we've seen are the flip commanders, as well as MDFC commanders like Valki God of Lies / Tybalt Cosmic Imposter. Tybalt Cosmic Imposter is essentially a planeswalker in your command zone, since you basically never have to cast Valki God of Lies if you don't really want to. Though because one side of this, the Valki God of Lies side, is a legendary creature, this is a legal commander. So why then is Grist a legal commander if one side of it isn't a creature and it doesn't say can be your commander? Now, while it does have the text, as long as Grist the Hunger Tide isn't on the battlefield, it's a 1/1 insect creature in addition to its other types. That doesn't exactly solve things. Essentially, from what I found, there's some sort of a rule out there, 604.3.A, because yeah, there's that many rules in Magic. Regardless, basically, Grist's ability is conditional and therefore doesn't meet certain requirements or whatnot. Basically, it doesn't function outside the game in that way. So though while Grist is technically a creature whenever it's in your deck or in your hand or in the graveyard or whatnot, it is not when it's outside the game. It is just a planeswalker, which is what the card says. Or at least it would be without a new clarification. In fact, Matt Tabak of Wizards of the Coast was directly asked, Grist cannot be your commander because it's not a creature during deck construction, correct? This would be because the ability only works in-game in other zones. But Matt Tabak responded that Grist can be your commander, its ability will function during deck construction. Further on, Matt clarified that this is not a characteristic-defining ability because there are conditions, but a new rule will tidy everything up. So, wrapping all of this discussion up, prepare for a new rule in the future that I'm sure is not going to be confusing at all, simply to make it so that this can be your commander. Regardless, because this can be your commander, and it's now been clarified that it can be, I am making a commander quick take on it, which is what this episode is. So with all of that confusing and probably unnecessary explanation aside, let's talk about how to build around Grist the Hunger Tide. The two things that I want to highlight on this card are the +1 and the -5. Again, the +1 is create a 1/1 black and green insect creature token, then mill a card. If an insect card was milled this way, put a loyalty counter on Grist and repeat this process. The key there is that this process repeats if you hit an insect. So every time you get an insect, you get one more 1/1, you mill another card, and you get another loyalty counter on Grist. Grist goes larger, so does your army, and so does your graveyard. And if you fill your graveyard up enough, Grist becomes incredibly deadly to your opponents with that -5. Which again is each opponent loses life equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. This can be a huge drain effect, which again you can activate really quickly with Grist if you want to. So again, if you hit insect after insect after insect, things can get out of control really quickly. Now there are definitely certain ways that you can set yourselves up for success with this kind of a deck. So first up, let's jump into some of the base cards for this deck. And of course, many of those cards are just going to be a ton of insects with things like Caustic Caterpillar, Scoop Mob, and Scoot Swarm. Again, the more insects that you have in this deck, the more likely you are to hit them when they're on top of your library and mill yourself further, making a bigger army, and also gaining more loyalty counters. And the higher your chance to hit these cards, the better. Now, there are a decent amount of useful insects like these, but it's definitely not one of the most popular tribes out there. With Caustic Caterpillar, you can pay 1 into green and sacrifice to destroy target artifact or enchantment. So it can be very useful in that way as a piece removal when you need it, and going into your graveyard is actually a good thing with this commander. And then Scoop Mob you can get down early, and then it can become gigantic throughout the game because it says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 5 or more lands, put 4++1 counters on Scoop Mob. And then the other Scoot with Scoot Swarm, it can actually grow your deck in a different direction going wide. It has landfall. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 1/1 green insect creature token. If you control 6 or more lands, create a token that's a copy of Scoot Swarm instead. Again, like I mentioned before, there are a decent amount of useful insects out there, but you might have to reach a bit for some of the lesser ones to include in this deck as well. Though on top of insects, make sure that you're also considering changelings. Changelings are every creature type no matter where they're at, including in your library. So if you mill one with your commander's +1, it's the exact same thing as milling an insect. Cards like Masked Vandal, Bloodline Pretender, and Realm Walker can come in huge for this deck. When Masked Vandal enters the battlefield, you can exile a creature card from your graveyard. If you do, exile target artifact or enchantment opponent controls. Now, losing a creature in our graveyard isn't the best thing, but it's always going to be a good option if we need to take care of something. And then Bloodline Pretender has, when it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type, so obviously we're choosing Insect. And then whenever another insect enters the battlefield under our control, we get a +1 counter on Bloodline Pretender. So yeah, the more we mill, the more insects we hit, the more insects we get with our commander, and the bigger this card gets. So this simple changeling can actually become a pretty big threat. And then next up is Realm Walker, which might just be the best insect in this deck, even though it's, again, not an insect. When it enters the battlefield, we choose Insect, and then we can look at the top card of our library at any time, and we can cast creature spells of the chosen type from the top of our library. Essentially, we always know what the top card of our library is going to be, so milling is a lot easier with our commander. If there's an insect there, we can choose to either cast it or start a mill chain. And if there's not an insect there, well, we can choose to mill it with something else, and we'll get to those here in a bit. Now, if you really want to lean heavily into the insect thing and win with that kind of a direction, you can use something like Blex if you really want to. Blex says other pests, bats, insects, snakes, and spiders you control get +1/+1. So now all of our 1/1 insects become twice as powerful, being 2/2s. So yeah, I mean, that's a big jump, but there are other ways to win with this kind of a commander. You know, like that -5 and just draining everyone out very quickly. But how do we quicken things and make that -5 into a game-winning activation? Let's jump into some cards that can help us mill even further with things like Perpetual Timepiece, Crawling Sensation, and Altar of Dementia. Perpetual Timepiece has tap, mill 2 cards. So this can mill us repeatedly throughout the game, which is fantastic for this kind of a deck. Crawling Sensation is going to mill us 2 cards at the beginning of our upkeep, and it also says whenever 1 or more land cards are put in your graveyard from anywhere for the first time each turn, put a 1/1 green insect creature token onto the battlefield. So not only does this mill us repeatedly, but it can also make us even more insects. And then there's Altar of Dementia, which can really put those insect tokens to good use. By sacrificing a creature, target player mills cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power. Now, although our insect tokens are just 1/1s, that's still going to add up a lot throughout the game. The more creatures that we mill into our graveyard, the deadlier our commander becomes. And also, if we're going to be sacrificing non-token creatures as well, that's going to add to our count too. But we've got some really big ways to speed up the process with things like Morality Shift and Peer into the Abyss. Morality Shift says, exchange your graveyard and your library, then shuffle your library. So if we cast this early enough, we can dump a ton of things into our graveyard and have a very small library. And again, with enough creatures in our graveyard, our commander suddenly becomes a one-shot kill. And then there's Peer into the Abyss, which works in a different way. It says target player draws cards equal to half the number of cards in their library and loses half their life, round up each time. So basically, we're going to be drawing half our library and losing half our life, which yes is a decent amount, but it's going to be well worth it for this. Essentially, we're going to be keeping the best 7 cards for a hand, and the rest is going to be, well, discarded into our graveyard. And again, with the number of creatures that we're going to be running in this deck, that's going to be plenty. Next up, let's talk about some cards that I have been waiting for a commander to really synergize with cards like Forever Young, Grave Purge, and Foot Bottom Feast. Forever Young says put any number of target creature cards from your graveyard on top of your library and draw a card. Actually, they all pretty much say that. The only difference is that the second 2 are actually instants. Regardless, each of these cards is actually fantastic for this commander. Now, yes, this is somewhat counterproductive because getting cards out of our graveyard makes our -5, well, bad. But getting a ton of creature cards on top of our library makes our +1 insane. Let's say we've got 15 insects in our graveyard. We cast one of these, we get all those creatures on top of our library, and then we activate Grist. That +1 is going to repeat for each of those creatures. So we create a 1/1 black and green insect creature token, we mill another card, we hit an insect, wow, who knew? And then we get a loyalty counter on Grist, and then we repeat. So we get a ton of insects into play, we mill all those creatures back into our graveyard, and Grist gets an absurd amount of counters. This builds us a massive army on top of setting ourselves up for a lot of -5 activations from Grist. So yeah, I'm really a fan of these cards in this kind of a deck. And of course, on top of Grist -5, we can finish our opponents off with things like Sir Conrad, Ayara First of Locthwain, and Zulaport Cutthroat. Sir Conrad punishes our opponents for a lot of things and really works well with those Forever Young types of cards. It says, whenever another creature dies or a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield or a creature card leaves your graveyard, Sir Conrad the Grim deals 1 damage to each opponent. So when we mill our creatures into our graveyard or get them out of our graveyard, Sir Conrad is going to be hurting our opponents. And also with the insects that our commander creates, if we sacrifice them or they just die, Sir Conrad still hurts our opponents. And then Ayara First of Locthwain says whenever she or another black creature enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Again, those insects that our commander makes are green and black. So Ayara is going to have a fun time draining our opponents and also sacrificing some insects to draw cards. And of course, any of the Blood Artist type cards like Zulaport Cutthroat can help us out as well. It says whenever it or another creature we control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and we gain 1 life. Again, we can make a ton of tokens with this kind of a deck, and we've got ways to sacrifice them, so we can drain our opponents out in absolutely no time. And speaking of tokens and cards that work with Planeswalkers, well, if you've got $50 lying around, yes, Doubling Season would be good for this deck. But if you don't have $50 lying around for this card, you're going to be fine, I promise. Now, outside of Grist being your commander, I think there are certain decks that could really utilize Grist well in the 99, such as Sidisi Brood Tyrant. Sidisi Brood Tyrant decks are generally self-mill decks where you're trying to fill your graveyard with a ton of creatures. Sidisi has, when she enters the battlefield or attacks, mill 2 cards. And whenever 1 or more creature cards are put in your graveyard from your library, put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield. So you mill a lot of creatures throughout the game with different types of effects, and you make yourself a lot of zombies. And by filling your graveyard, you make Grist incredibly deadly with its -5 once you get it there. Of course, you can also utilize Grist for removal with its -2. You can utilize those insects or even the zombies that you're creating. So, continuing the self-mill trend, Tassiger the Golden Fang is another commander that might want to consider Grist. Tassiger has Delve, and by paying 2 Simic, you put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard, then you return a non-land card of an opponent's choice from your graveyard to your hand. So Tassiger decks can fill their graveyard incredibly quickly and utilize their graveyard in different ways. Regardless, if you've got a creature-heavy Tassiger deck, then Grist might be an option. Or if you've got a creature-heavy Muldrotha deck, that might be an option as well. Muldrotha the Gravetide says during each of your turns you may play up to 1 permanent card of each permanent type from your graveyard. So, filling your graveyard essentially just gives you an extra hand. So that can make Grist incredibly powerful with that -5. On top of that, Grist actually, when it's in your graveyard, is not only a planeswalker, but also a creature. So if you want to recast it from your graveyard thanks to Muldrotha, it can fill either role. Next up, Blex. Yes, that's right, Blex Vexing Pest is back. Again, it's a pest, so it's gotta keep pestering you. Okay, that was bad. Anyways, like I said before, this commander is an anthem for various creatures, including insects. So if for whatever reason you are building an insect tribal Blex deck, yes, Grist can fit right into that. And finally, Grix might even be a potential consideration for Super Friends decks, though maybe not. So if you've gotten a Trax Super Friends deck, you'll have to let me know if you're considering this one or not. Super Friends decks don't tend to have too many creatures in them, and I'm assuming not many insects either. But at the very least, Grix can be useful to make some creatures and utilize some of those creatures not only as blockers, but also as ways to take out other creatures and planeswalkers. And keep in mind that if you've got a planeswalker that can recur creatures, that's going to be very beneficial for Grist. And now it's time for me to wrap things up and give you my final thoughts on Grist the Hunger Tide. Again, confusing rulings aside, this is actually a really interesting commander. When set up correctly, the +1 and -5 work fantastically together. You can flood the board with creatures, fill your graveyard, and drain your opponents out in absolutely no time. And although I didn't really go into detail about it, that -2 is pretty powerful as well. Being able to sacrifice a creature, destroy target creature or planeswalker is good too. Regardless, definitely an interesting and unique commander to say the least. And with that, this show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.